You've said something you regretted the second it left your mouth. Everyone has. That specific, sinking feeling when a sentence is already out in the room and there's no version of physics that lets you pull it back. Most people treat that as an unavoidable cost of being human, something you apologize for and move past. But there's a small, specific set of things intelligent people have simply trained themselves to stop saying altogether, not because they never feel the impulse, but because they've noticed, again and again, exactly what those particular sentences cost them. What makes these 6 worth studying specifically, rather than just generic advice about watching what you say, is that none of them are dramatic. Nobody builds a reputation for untrustworthiness from one screaming match or one obvious lie. Reputations like that get built quietly, in the accumulation of small, forgettable moments, a boast here, a dismissed idea there, a promise made too easily, a mistake explained away instead of owned. Each individual instance is small enough to seem harmless in isolation. It's only in the pattern, viewed from a distance, that the actual cost becomes visible, and by the time it's visible, it's usually already shaped how a significant number of people quietly think about you. Over the next 29 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 6 of them, patterns of speech that quietly undermine trust, credibility, and connection every single time they're used, no matter how smart or well-intentioned the person saying them actually is. This isn't about being quieter or more passive. It's about understanding that your words are doing far more work than you realize, shaping how people see you long after the specific conversation is forgotten. Number 4 is the one that costs people the most without them ever noticing it happening, because on the surface it looks like kindness. Stay with me, because by the end of this you'll never think about a simple "sure, I'm in the same way again." Stoic philosophy treats speech as something closer to a moral discipline than a communication skill. Words, in that framing, aren't just sounds you make to fill space. They're a direct reflection of your actual character, whether you intend them to be or not. Every one of the 6 patterns ahead traces back to the same underlying principle, that the gap between what you say and what's actually true, useful, or necessary is where most damage to trust and credibility quietly accumulates, one small sentence at a time, usually without anyone, including you, noticing until the pattern has repeated often enough to become a reputation. It's worth being honest about why these 6 patterns are so common despite how obviously costly they are once you see them clearly. Each one offers something real in the immediate moment. Boasting offers a small hit of validation. Dismissing an idea offers a shortcut past discomfort. Complaining offers temporary release. An easy promise offers someone else's momentary approval. Denying a mistake offers protection from judgment. And reflexive agreement offers the avoidance of an awkward no. None of these are irrational impulses. They're all short-term traits that feel good the instant you make them and only reveal their actual cost later, spread out across weeks or months, by which point it's genuinely hard to trace the damage back to any single sentence. That delay is exactly what makes these patterns so persistent. The cost is real, but it's never immediate enough to naturally teach you out of the habit on its own. 1. Avoid boasting about knowledge. You've almost certainly met someone who can't get through a conversation without steering it, eventually, back toward what they know, the books, the projects, the credentials, the expertise, laid out one after another until the exchange stops feeling like a conversation and starts feeling like a resume being read aloud. The strange thing is how the effect changes over time. The first time, it might genuinely impress you. By the 5th or 6th time, the impression has curdled into something closer to exhaustion. I knew someone like this for a few years. I'll call him John, a genuinely accomplished tech professional who had, by any objective measure, earned the right to talk about his expertise. In meetings and casual gatherings alike, he consistently found a way to steer the conversation back toward the major projects he'd led, the complex systems he'd mastered, the recognition he'd received along the way. Early on, people were genuinely engaged. Over time, though, something shifted. Conversations with John started to feel less like an exchange and more like an audience being assembled for a performance. It took a colleague, eventually, telling him directly that while nobody doubted his knowledge, the way he kept presenting it was quietly pushing people away, for John to actually register what had been happening. What's worth understanding here is the specific mechanism at work, because it explains why boasting backfires even when every individual claim being made is completely true. Knowledge, displayed constantly and unprompted, doesn't just fail to impress after a certain point. It actively creates distance, because every unsolicited demonstration of expertise implicitly measures the listener against it, whether that's the intent or not. Nobody enjoys feeling quietly graded in a conversation they thought was just a conversation, and repeated exposure to that feeling is exactly what drives people to start finding reasons to be somewhere else when the boaster walks into the room. Marcus Aurelius made a point worth sitting with directly. Nature doesn't announce or take credit for what it produces, and neither should we feel entitled to advertise our own wisdom as though it needed a spokesperson. That's not really an argument for false modesty. It's a recognition that genuine competence has never actually needed a verbal campaign to be recognized. It shows up in the quality of the work, in how someone handles a difficult problem when it actually matters, in the judgment they demonstrate under real pressure. All of that speaks considerably louder and more credibly than any amount of self-description ever could. What eventually changed for John is worth naming specifically because it wasn't dramatic. He simply started talking less about himself and paying more attention to what other people in the room were actually saying. Rather than trying to dominate every exchange with his own expertise, he shifted toward contributing when it was genuinely useful and listening the rest of the time. The change in how people treated him afterward was noticeable and fairly quick. People started seeking him out again, not despite his knowledge, but specifically because the way he now shared it made room for other people rather than crowding them out. There's a workplace version of this worth naming, because it's one of the more common places the pattern shows up with real career consequences. The senior employee who can't let a junior colleague finish explaining an idea without inserting a story about how they solved something similar years ago, bigger and more impressive, teaches that junior colleague something specific and lasting. Don't bother bringing new ideas to this person, because the conversation will always end up back on them. Over enough repetitions, that senior employee ends up cut out of exactly the kind of early-stage thinking that would have kept their own expertise current, not because anyone decided to exclude them deliberately, but because being excluded from that dynamic became the path of least resistance for everyone else. It's worth being precise about what this isn't, because the point can easily be misread as an argument for hiding your competence entirely. Sharing knowledge when someone genuinely needs it, teaching a skill when asked, offering expertise that directly solves a problem in front of you. None of that is boasting, and withholding it out of excessive modesty would be its own kind of failure. The distinction that actually matters is between knowledge offered because it's useful to someone else in that specific moment, and knowledge offered because the moment presented a convenient occasion to remind the room of how much you know. The first builds trust. The second, no matter how technically accurate the content, slowly spends it. The practical takeaway, worth carrying forward: let your actions and your work demonstrate what you know, and reserve direct statements of expertise for the moments they're genuinely useful to someone else, rather than the moments they're useful to your own image. Practice humility, not as false modesty, but as a willingness to let other people discover your value through actual interaction rather than through a running commentary you're providing about yourself. And listen deliberately and often, because listening isn't a gap in the conversation waiting to be filled. It's a form of confidence in its own right, the kind that doesn't need constant reinforcement to feel secure. There's a version of this worth naming in a completely different setting: dinner parties, where the person who dominates every topic with their own expertise, wine, travel, whatever the conversation happens to touch, often walks away convinced the evening went well, while everyone else quietly agrees they'd rather not sit next to that person again. The disconnect between how the boaster experiences the room and how the room actually experiences them is the whole problem in miniature. Expertise, performed loudly enough, stops being information and starts being an imposition on everyone else's airtime, and most people can feel that shift long before they could ever articulate it. 2. Never dismiss others' opinions. There's a particular kind of pain in having an idea waved off before you've even finished explaining it, the sense that your thinking, and by extension you, simply weren't worth the extra 30 seconds it would have taken to actually hear the whole thing out. It's a small moment, usually, but it tends to compound in a specific and corrosive way because it doesn't just cost the idea. It teaches the person whose idea got dismissed not to bother offering the next one. I know this dynamic uncomfortably well because early in a leadership role I once found myself on the other side of it. Confident in my own ability to make fast, decisive calls, I interrupted a colleague mid-explanation during a meeting and dismissed their proposed workflow change as impractical, thinking I was efficiently saving everyone's time. What followed was a silence I didn't fully register in the moment. A few hesitant glances, a meeting that continued, but with noticeably less energy behind it. Fewer ideas offered for the rest of the discussion. It wasn't until afterward, when a trusted colleague quietly told me the idea hadn't actually been as bad as it sounded when I'd cut it off, that the cost of what I'd done actually landed. What that moment cost wasn't just one idea, though that alone mattered. It was the beginning of a pattern, a team gradually learning, correctly, that offering something half-formed in front of me carried real risk of being shut down before it had a chance to develop into something useful. Marcus Aurelius wrote a line that applies with uncomfortable precision here. You cannot learn anything the moment you've decided you already know everything worth knowing about the subject in front of you. Dismissing an idea before it's been fully heard is exactly that decision, made instantly and usually without any real awareness that a decision was even being made. What changed for me afterward was deliberate, and worth naming specifically because it's replicable. In subsequent meetings, I reminded myself, actively, that listening to an idea all the way through doesn't obligate you to agree with it. It simply respects the person enough to let the idea exist in full before it gets evaluated. Adopting that habit produced something I genuinely didn't expect. A team that started contributing solutions I would never have arrived at on my own, specifically because they'd stopped filtering their ideas down to only the ones they were confident enough wouldn't get shot down. There's a specific reframe worth practicing here, because it changes the entire tenor of how you receive an idea you're initially skeptical of. Instead of immediately reaching for, how do I counter this? Try asking, what can I actually learn from this? Even ideas that turn out to be genuinely flawed usually contain something useful, a different read on the problem, an assumption worth examining, a perspective you hadn't fully considered. And when there's truly nothing salvageable in the idea itself, you still walk away understanding how the other person sees the situation, which has its own standalone value in any collaborative relationship. There's a version of this worth naming in personal relationships too, not just workplaces. A partner who consistently waves off a spouse's concerns about finances or parenting with an instant "that won't work" or "we've been over this," without actually engaging with the specific point being raised, is running the exact same pattern at home that I ran in that meeting. And the long-term cost is the same too. The other person eventually stops bringing things up at all, not because the concerns disappeared, but because voicing them stopped feeling worth the friction. There's also a subtler version of this worth naming, because it doesn't always look like an outright dismissal. Sometimes it shows up as a technically polite, interesting, but that arrives so quickly after someone finishes speaking that it's obvious the response was being drafted before the explanation was even complete. The words are respectful. The timing gives away that no real listening happened in between. People register that gap between tone and timing more accurately than most of us give them credit for, and it produces the same quiet withdrawal as a blunter dismissal would, just delivered more slowly. 3. Refrain from complaining without purpose. Picture someone, call him Peter, a mid-career professional with a genuinely full plate, deadlines, family obligations, the ordinary friction of daily life. None of that makes Peter unusual. What makes him worth talking about is what he does with all of it. He complains, constantly, about nearly everything. Inefficient co-workers, a perpetually broken office coffee machine, traffic, the weather, a running catalog of grievances with no apparent bottom. At first, his colleagues responded the way most people do to a friend's frustration, with sympathy, sometimes even offers of help. But as weeks turned into months, something shifted. Conversations with Peter became something people quietly started managing their exposure to, not because they'd stopped caring about him, but because a constant stream of complaints, with no apparent aim beyond the venting itself, is simply exhausting to be around indefinitely. It took a friend, eventually, asking him plainly over lunch, "I understand you're frustrated, but what are you actually doing to fix any of this?" For something to genuinely shift in how Peter saw his own habit. What that question exposed was that Peter hadn't actually been looking for solutions at any point. He'd been venting, purely, and venting without any direction doesn't just wear down the people listening. It actively reinforces the venter's own sense of helplessness, training the mind to treat frustration as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state that action might actually change. Marcus Aurelius's framing on control applies directly here. Your power lives in your own mind, not in outside events. And complaining about things you have no actual influence over, traffic, weather, other people's competence, does nothing but magnify a feeling of powerlessness that was already unpleasant enough without the amplification. It's worth being precise here, because the point isn't that complaining is always wrong. A complaint aimed at an actual fix, raised to the right person, with a specific ask attached, can be the first real step toward solving something. What corrodes trust and drains relationships is complaint without direction, noise that accomplishes nothing except making both the speaker and the listener feel slightly worse than they did before the conversation started. Complaining about traffic doesn't clear a single road. Complaining about the weather has never once stopped rain. The practical test worth applying, every time frustration arises, is simple. Ask yourself directly, is there anything I can actually do about this? If the honest answer is no, the healthier move is to let it go rather than voice it repeatedly, and redirect that energy somewhere it can actually produce something. Reflection, a genuine change in approach, or, when the situation genuinely allows for it, simple acceptance. And where the frustration does point towards something within your control, the more useful reframe is trading, "Why does this always happen to me?" for "What can I actually learn or change here?" A shift that turns a dead-end emotional loop into something that might genuinely move you forward. Peter, to his credit, actually took the question to heart. Instead of continuing to complain about his manager, he started arriving at conversations with specific, thought-out suggestions instead. Instead of grumbling through his commute, he started using the time for something else entirely, audiobooks, or simply quiet reflection. Over time, people noticed this shift, not because Peter announced it, but because his words had stopped carrying the same weight of accumulated negativity. Colleagues who used to quietly avoid him started seeking him out instead, drawn to a calm, solution-oriented presence that hadn't been there before. There's a specific distinction worth practicing daily, because it's easy to blur in the moment. The difference between processing a genuine frustration once, out loud, to someone who can actually help or simply witness it, versus rehearsing the same grievance on a loop to whoever happens to be nearby. The first is healthy and human. The second is what actually drains a room, because it offers the listener nothing to do with the information, no action to take, no insight to offer, just an invitation to absorb frustration that was never going anywhere in the first place. 4. No empty promises. Promises carry a specific kind of weight most people underestimate until they've watched what happens when that weight goes unaccounted for. They shape expectations, and repeated breaches of them, even small, well-intentioned ones, do quiet, cumulative damage to trust that's considerably harder to repair than most people assume going in. Consider someone like Greg, a professional in his 50s juggling a demanding career alongside real family responsibilities. Greg wasn't dishonest or careless by nature. If anything, he was overeager to please, which is precisely what got him into trouble. He'd promise his team a report review by Monday, or tell his family he'd be home in time for dinner, and then, repeatedly, fall short of both. Early on, the people around him extended understanding, chalking it up to a genuinely demanding schedule. But as the pattern continued, the goodwill wore thin. His team began quietly discounting his commitments in advance, building in a buffer for the likelihood he wouldn't actually deliver on the stated timeline. At home, the frustration built more personally, until, one evening after he'd missed yet another family event, his teenage daughter left a note on his desk that read simply, "We just want you to mean it when you say it." That note did something no amount of professional feedback had managed to do. It made the actual cost of the pattern impossible to avoid seeing. Greg had never intended any of it maliciously. His promises were consistently well-meaning in the moment they were made. But well-meaning and reliable are not the same thing, and the gap between them was exactly what had been eroding the trust he'd spent years building, one small unfulfilled commitment at a time. Marcus Aurelius's guidance on this is almost uncomfortably direct. Let your words be plain and true, a standard that applies as much to commitments about the future as it does to statements about the present. The practical fix here isn't about becoming less generous or agreeable. It's about pausing deliberately before agreeing to anything, asking honestly whether you actually have the time, energy, and resources the commitment requires, rather than answering from whatever optimism or social pressure happens to be present in that specific moment. Where the answer is genuinely uncertain, a more honest version of the commitment. I'll aim to have this ready by tomorrow, but I'll flag it if I need more time. Protects the relationship far better than a confident yes that quietly turns into disappointment later. There's a specific strategy worth naming here too, because it flips the usual dynamic in your favor rather than merely avoiding damage. Underpromise deliberately and let yourself occasionally overdeliver. Greg, once he'd internalized the lesson, started telling his team he'd need 3 full days for a review, and then, when things went smoothly, delivering in 2. That small adjustment did more for his reputation than any grand gesture could have. It built, gradually, a track record of reliability that people came to trust precisely because it was consistently, quietly exceeded rather than precisely met or missed. And when a commitment genuinely can't be kept despite your best intentions, the Stoic instinct is to address it directly rather than let it quietly slide. A real apology, a brief, honest explanation, and a proposed path forward, rather than silence or excuses discovered after the fact. Greg eventually rebuilt what he'd worn down, not through any single gesture, but through a sustained pattern of commitments that were smaller, more deliberate, and consistently honored. What he noticed in himself, by his own account, wasn't just external trust returning. It was an internal sense of peace that came specifically from knowing his words and his actions had finally lined back up. There's a version of this worth naming that shows up specifically in digital communication, where promises get made faster and more casually than almost anywhere else. A quick, "I'll send that over tonight," typed into a chat, without a real check on whether the evening actually has room for it, is functionally the same broken promise as Greg's missed report deadlines, just lower stakes and higher frequency. Because these small digital commitments feel so minor individually, they rarely get the same deliberate pause that a bigger promise might receive, which is exactly why they tend to accumulate fastest and do some of the quietest, least examined damage to how reliable someone appears over time. If this one landed for you, drop "I love this wisdom" in the comments. It genuinely helps me know which of these 6 are actually hitting home. 5. Don't deny your mistakes. There's a specific, familiar fear behind denying a mistake. The sense that admitting fault is handing over ammunition, exposing a weakness other people will use against you later. For a long time, that was more or less how I approached it too, until one specific experience rearranged that assumption almost completely. I was leading a major project at work, and under pressure to meet a tight deadline, I overlooked several critical details in a report that went out under my name. The inaccuracies didn't stay contained. They drew direct criticism from upper management, aimed at my whole team, for a mistake that was mine. My first instinct, in the immediate aftermath, was exactly what you'd expect: build a defense. Blame the workload, the timeline, anything external that could plausibly absorb some of the responsibility instead of me. But something about that instinct didn't sit right even as I was reaching for it. And at the next team meeting, I did something different. I named the mistake plainly, apologized directly to the people it had affected, and laid out specific steps to make sure it wouldn't happen the same way again. What happened next genuinely surprised me. Instead of the judgment I'd been quietly bracing for, my colleagues responded with something closer to appreciation. A few even thanked me directly for setting an example of taking real accountability rather than deflecting it. What I understood only after the fact was that admitting the mistake hadn't made me look weaker in anyone's eyes. It had made me measurably more trustworthy, in a way that a flawless-seeming denial never could have. Marcus Aurelius put language to exactly this dynamic. If someone can show you where you were wrong, in thought or action, you should welcome the correction gladly, because truth is what you're actually after, and truth has never genuinely harmed the person willing to face it. The harm, almost always, comes from the alternative, the slow, compounding damage of defensiveness, denial, and the walls those responses build between you and the people whose trust you're trying to hold on to. There's a mechanism worth naming directly here, because it explains why owning a mistake tends to work better than most people expect going in. Taking responsibility signals, unambiguously, that you value the truth of a situation more than your own short-term image, and that signal does 2 things simultaneously. It builds trust in you specifically, And it creates permission for everyone else around you to be honest about their own mistakes too, rather than defaulting to the same defensive posture you'd have modeled if you'd denied yours. A team or a family that watches one person handle a real mistake with honesty tends to become, gradually, a team or family where mistakes get surfaced and fixed early rather than hidden and compounded. The practical version of this is worth naming plainly. When something goes wrong, resist the reflex to immediately locate blame elsewhere, and instead ask, honestly, what your own role actually was, even if it's only a fraction of the full picture. Owning that fraction, cleanly, is usually the actual first step toward a real solution, and it tends to matter far more to the people around you than a technically accurate account of everyone else's contributing failures. And don't stop at the apology itself. Follow it with visible action that demonstrates you're actually addressing the underlying problem, not just managing the immediate discomfort of having been caught. There's a leadership-specific version of this worth naming, because the stakes tend to scale with the size of the audience watching. A manager who publicly owns a decision that didn't pan out, rather than quietly redistributing blame across the team that executed it, tends to build a specific kind of loyalty that's difficult to manufacture any other way. People notice and remember who took the hit when things went wrong, and that memory shapes how hard they're willing to work for that person the next time things get difficult. Denial might protect a reputation for a single news cycle. Ownership tends to build one that survives considerably longer. 6. Don't overcommit just to avoid saying no. There's a specific kind of person almost everyone knows. Warm, agreeable, seemingly always willing to help, with a default answer to nearly every request that sounds something like, "Sure, count me in," delivered instantly, often before the actual scope of the ask has been fully considered. Picture someone like Jim, genuinely well-meaning, the kind of person who says yes to helping a friend move, yes to an extra project at work, yes to attending every event he's invited to, all with real, uncomplicated enthusiasm in the moment. The trouble, over time, wasn't Jim's intentions. It was the accumulation. As life got busier, those layered commitments started to genuinely outpace what any one person could actually deliver on, and Jim began, more and more often, forgetting or simply failing to show up for things he'd agreed to with complete sincerity weeks earlier. The moment that actually clarified things for him involved a close friend's family dinner. An invitation Jim accepted enthusiastically, in the moment, and then quietly double-booked against a work meeting he scheduled afterward without fully registering the conflict. He missed the dinner. The next day, his friend told him plainly how disappointed the family had been. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It didn't need to be, because the disappointment itself was enough to make Jim actually see the pattern he'd been running for years. Promises made sincerely, in the moment, meant to please whoever was asking, that had gradually become hollow through sheer repetition and volume, doing more damage to the relationships he genuinely cared about than an honest, "I can't" ever would have. Marcus Aurelius's guidance applies here with almost uncomfortable precision. If it isn't right, don't do it. And if it isn't true, don't say it. A standard that extends directly to commitments, where an enthusiastic yes offered without any real intention or capacity to follow through is, functionally, a small untruth, however kindly it was meant in the moment it was spoken. What's worth naming directly is the actual motive usually sitting underneath chronic overcommitment. It's rarely generosity in its purest form. More often, it's a fear of the discomfort involved in disappointing someone directly, in the present tense, traded for a much larger disappointment deferred to some later date when the commitment inevitably falls through. The math on that trade is almost always worse than it looks in the moment. A single honest no, delivered clearly, tends to cost far less relational capital than a broken promise discovered after the other person had already built plans around your yes. The practical adjustment here starts with a pause before any commitment, a genuine check on whether the request actually fits your real priorities and capacity, rather than an instant, reflexive yes offered to avoid the brief discomfort of a maybe or a no. Where the honest answer is uncertain, a direct and respectful no protects the relationship considerably better than a hesitant yes that quietly evaporates later. It's also worth prioritizing quality of commitment over sheer quantity. Following through completely on a smaller number of promises does more for how you're perceived and for how you feel about yourself than spreading enthusiasm thin across commitments you were never actually going to fully honor. Jim, to his credit, made the adjustment. He started saying no to requests he genuinely couldn't accommodate and reserved his yes for the commitments that actually mattered most to him and followed through on those completely. Over time, the shift changed how people related to him. He became known, gradually, not for saying yes to absolutely everything, but for the fact that whatever he did agree to, he reliably delivered, a considerably more durable form of respect than the momentary approval his old habit used to chase. There's a specific social pressure worth naming that makes this pattern especially hard to break, because it isn't purely internal. It's reinforced constantly by the people around the overcommitter. Friends and colleagues learn quickly who says yes reflexively, and that knowledge shapes how requests get made going forward. The reliably agreeable person tends to get asked more often and asked more casually, precisely because saying yes has become the expected, low-friction response. Breaking the pattern isn't just a private decision. In other words, it usually involves visibly disappointing people who had, without quite realizing it, come to depend on the old default. That's part of why the shift feels so uncomfortable at first, and part of why it's worth pushing through the discomfort anyway. The alternative is an indefinite continuation of promises that were never fully sound to begin with. Run back through all 6, and the pattern underneath every one of them is the same. Each is a small, specific gap between what gets said and what's actually true, useful, or deliverable. And every one of those gaps, left unaddressed, quietly compounds into something that costs far more than the momentary comfort it bought in the first place. Boasting trades connection for a fleeting sense of being impressive. Dismissing an idea trades a team's honesty for the illusion of efficiency. Complaining without purpose trades genuine relief for a loop of amplified helplessness. Empty promises trade a moment of pleasing someone for a much larger, later cost to trust. Denying a mistake trades a temporary shield for a permanent erosion of credibility. And chronic overcommitment trades the discomfort of a clear no for the much deeper disappointment of a broken yes. What ties all 6 together, if you step back far enough to see it, is a single underlying discipline the Stoics kept returning to in different forms. The willingness to let your words cost you something small now. A moment of humility, an uncomfortable no, an admission of fault, rather than let them cost you something much larger later, quietly, in the form of trust you don't get to watch erode in real time. That trade is almost never obvious in the moment it's being made. It only becomes visible in hindsight, usually well after the pattern has already shaped how people think of you. None of these 6 require perfection to fix, just attention, applied consistently, to the specific moment right before you speak. That pause, small as it is where all of this actually happens. Use it well, and your words start doing something most people's never quite manage. They start meaning exactly what they say, every time, which turns out to be one of the rarer and more genuinely respected qualities a person can have.